From childhood's hour I have not been as others were. Is all that we see or seem but a dream within a dream? Hello, I'm Stephen E. Andrews, author, bookseller, collector, general culture vulture. Welcome to the channel. If you're new here, please like, subscribe and comment because I'd love to hear what you think. And today we're doing another one of those clickbaity type things, which you all know and love. And it's sort of top 10 obscure horror. With me, when I do a top 10, it's always a bit more than 10, of course, which is nice, showing my generosity of spirit. And, it's obviously Halloween's coming, and I'm going to get this out there before then, because by that point I'll be busy filming other things and doing some SF and what have you. So I thought I'd do it today, and it's been a hell of a week. It really has. So it's kind of appropriate, really. So I'm here on my own on Saturday. I've just got about an hour to film this before the video widow comes home, bless her heart. So I just thought I'd share with you some of my obscure horror favourites for you to seek out. This is a book which should be famous, and in serious horror circles it is famous. This is The King in Yellow by Robert W. Chambers, which came to more prominence in recent years because of references to it in the TV series True Detective in season 1, which is absolutely fantastic. I do urge you to watch it, whether you like crime or horror or just great writing in general. And this is a edition published by, let's think, is it Pushkin? Pushkin Press, which came out a few years ago, and it's the first really nice edition in hardcover for a very long time. So check that out if you don't know it. But it's really here just to provide a context, as is the Lucio Fulci poster behind me, because I do like horror. I got into horror when I was about 11-year-old, first year of secondary school, and I bought Dennis Gifford's Pictorial History of the Horror Movie, which is the basis of the beginning of my understanding of horror, both in film and literature, and it went on from there, really. And I do love it. And I know I've said before on the channel that I don't think horror is a genre. That doesn't mean I'm not going to use the word, because it's a marketing approach, it's a feel, it's all sort of things, and I'll talk about that again. And if you're interested in that sort of thing, do check out my folk horror season from the early days of the channel. There's a playlist just for that. So, obscure horror, obscure modern horror to be specific. So first of all, what do I mean by modern? Now, my usage of the word modern is characterized by critical thinking and philosophy and social science and those sort of things. So I don't mean now. Now is the contemporary. Modern, I relate to modernism, to a particular period, because the word modern has been in use since the ancient Greeks. It's not a new thing at all, and that's the irony. It's a contemporaneous thing that sort of evolves with you. But for me, modernism ended in the 80s in some fields and a bit later in others, and we are definitely in the postmodern, or what I prefer to call the contemporary field now. So really, I'm going to talk about horror from the birth of the modern period, which is sort of late 19th century up until the 80s. There's some things later than that. It'll mostly be stuff from between about the 70s, 80s, 90s. So it's not contemporary, though there are some authors who are contemporary. Because what I've noticed in my job as a bookseller, there is increasing interest in horror. And a lot of this is down to the wonderful book by Grady Hendrix called Paperbacks from Hell, which looks like this. Grady's book almost single-handedly has been responsible for raising the prices of ratty old A-format paperbacks in terrible condition, where now if you want one of those wonderful lurid covered things from the 70s or 80s, which I remember well because I bought loads of them and read loads of them, now you can pay absurd sums of money, and it's really quite laughable, but people are doing it, and they're not really bothered about condition, but that's another story. So that's what I mean by modern. I'm talking not about today, but over a span of decades going back quite a while. And in terms of obscure, this is an interesting one as well, because as I say, I see in my job there's an increased interest in horror because of Grady Hendrix's book. But the impression I really get is that people want to branch out and try new things because they're rather bored of the same old Stephen King and H.P. Lovecraft. And this is true with an increasing number of people. It's happening gradually over the last few years. And I found really in my job that if I take almost any horror novel or short story which people haven't come across, be it sort of new, old, ancient, and if I write a little recommends under it, so drawing their attention to it, usually it sells. People want to branch out, and I think this is a really good thing. And people reading horror seem to really want to experiment these days, which is just great news really, because it's a field which is sadly neglected, especially by the literati who look down on it. And yet if you look at the history of English or American literature or any other number of literatures, all the world's great writers would write a ghost or horror story at some point, and maybe even a novel. So there's nothing wrong with it. It's part of the corpus of story. It's a really important part of the history of fiction, so we shouldn't be ashamed of it. And of course, interestingly, it has a different aesthetic standard, as I'll talk about when we come to Sean Hudson. But really, as I say, people are trying all sorts of things. It's also still frustrating at times because I think young people, particularly when they're discovering the genre, it's been so dominated by one author since 1976, and that's Stephen King. And a lot of the time when you're trying to run a horror section in a bookshop, you might have one bay, if you're lucky, about 7 or 8 shelves, and 2 or 3 of those will be full of Stephen King because he sells like mad, and he's the best-selling author in the world for 25 years, you know, and obviously he's got his virtues. I've read about 10 of his books. I'm not particularly a fan. I don't think he's anywhere near as good as people say he is, though, you know, when he is good, he's very good. But I do get the feeling that, you know, young people are sort of like, oh, Stephen King, Stephen King, Stephen King, Stephen King. And yeah, I'm jaded with it because I put up with it through my career for 38 years. I've just seen people tunnel visioned to King and not going beyond that, when of course there are lots of other great horror writers. If you think of the other people who've been big since the 70s, hit their stride then or a bit later, obviously James Herbert was really big while he was alive. Clive Barker had a brief but meteoric rise when he was writing things like the Books of Blood and the Damnation Game. Great stuff, they really are. And King, you know, has remained dominant. But one of the funny things I find when I talk to people who love Stephen King, and people who buy horror are always lovely. I don't know what it is. You know, they'll be dressed in black, people think they're morbid, what have you, but they're always lovely human beings. You know, these are not people who are out there sort of committing terrible acts of violence or saying dreadful things or whatever. They're always really charming people, and that's the thing. You know, it's catharsis. They understand that. It's instinctive. Is that a lot of them who are King fanatics, they've never heard, for example, of Stephen King's son, Joe Hill. Now, Joe Hill, of course, called himself Joe Hill because he didn't want anybody to know that he was King's son and give him an unfair advantage, because he was outed pretty quickly because he won a load of awards with his short stories. And I was going to talk about his first novel, Heart-Shaped Box, today, which I think is a fantastic traditional horror novel, but I can't find my copy. Actually, I can. I know what it is, but I've spent about half an hour setting this up, and it would take me another half an hour to dig it out. So I do apologise. So I will talk about that again. But if you're a Stephen King fan, the first thing you should do to move on is you should read a book by his son called Heart-Shaped Box. Joe Hill, Heart-Shaped Box, which is a wonderful, doomy, traditional horror novel set in the world of heavy metal, and it captures the sort of atmosphere of the sort of Midlands where heavy metal was born, with bands like Black Sabbath, Judas Priest, and the main protagonist is from that. I'm not going to talk about it too much. Do seek it out. I will talk about it again on the channel because I really wanted to put it in my top 10, but I've got a lot of other things to talk about. Just also as an aside, some of the things which people have been buying from me for the last few years, and it's been hard because the pandemic to sort of establish sales pattern and availability of things has been off and on very often with these things. Things which I've sold loads and loads of in recent years have been, for example, the Japanese ghost stories of Lafcadio Hearn in Penguin Classics here. And I've sold bucket loads of this. It's been absolutely fantastic. I've also sold loads of Arthur Machen, the Welsh writer. If you're not familiar with Machen, he has connections to Lovecraft and Colin Wilson. I will do something about him at some point. There's a brief video on the channel where I visit his birthplace in Caerleon. That's revisited in my video on Colin Wilson's Return of the Lloigor, which is a Lovecraftian Cthulhu mythos tale. So he as well, I've sold loads and loads of his books, and in hardcover to people who've never heard of him. They've trusted my judgment, and when I've said to them, this guy's the Welsh Lovecraft, they've just gone ape, and they absolutely love it, and they come back and they say it's great stuff. So Stephen King, read some Joe Hill. Also, do take a look at the works of Richard Matheson, who I'm going to talk about extensively at one point, who really made the template for the modern American horror writer after about 1950. Superb writer, and he wrote things like I Am Legend, What Dreams May Come, Stir of Echoes, Hell House. Nearly everything he sort of wrote was made into a film, and one of my favourite books is his book The Shrinking Man, filmed as The Incredible Shrinking Man. Amazing science fiction novel, really, really good stuff. So those are people to look at. So the top 10, I'm not going to do it chronologically. I'm going to kind of do it in format. And just to say, I am going to do some more film stuff coming up. And just to show you something I got in the post yesterday, which is The Hunchback of Notre Dame, 1923 Universal version, Blu-ray for the first time from Eureka. And I've got the one with the old card slipcase. And of course, this has Lon Chaney in it. And this has got wonderful interviews with Kim Newman and Jonathan Rigby about the film. And I'm yet to sit down and watch the film. I've never seen it all the way through. I know I've seen bits of it. And this is a great presentation, and there's also a feature-length commentary on here with Kim Newman and Alan Jones. Not Alan Jones. Alan Jones is the expert on Dario Argento. I mean Stephen Jones, who edits Best New Horror every year and has done for ages. So that'd be brilliant, because those guys are great at commentary. So I might even keep it for Halloween, even though it's more of a melodrama, really, based on a novel by Victor Hugo with lots of sort of social and political aspects. So when are we going to get there? We're going to start to get there now. As I say, I'm just going to go with this as the things come up. One of my favourite horror books from the late 80s is this wonderful novel, Meat, by Ian Watson. And Ian is best known as an SF writer. He's got a huge oeuvre. He provided a blurb for the back of my book 100 must-read science fiction novels, or at least a quotation, which was really, really good. We've had a couple of contacts, never in person, only through correspondence, and he's an interesting guy, very interesting writer. And Meat is a vegetarian horror novel. This was published as a paperback original, like this, from Headline, in A format, as you see. And this was in, let's take a look at the date, 1988. I would have said 88, but I decided not to chance it. There was a simultaneous, was there a simultaneous hardcover? I don't think there was, because what Headline did then with these things, a lot of them, they'd use the same text block printing, and they just put sort of boards around, and they didn't bother with Meat, I don't think, which was a shame, because he did another book at the time called The Power, which is good, horror novel again with SF elements. Not as quite as good as this. And this is a vegetarian horror novel, and as you see, there's somebody wielding a cleaver and looks wonderfully lurid. And it's basically about a family. They sort of move to a rural area, and one of their daughters saves a wild rabbit from a weasel, and they fall in with this sort of strange force which is carnivorous and malevolent. And there's a thing about the Animal Liberation Front in there, a battery chicken farm, and it's really, really great. There's really spits in which really made me squirm, and I'm quite hardcore, I read a lot of transgressive fiction and strange things, and it really got to me, I must say. I didn't become a vegetarian, but there you go, vegetarian horror. It's out of print. I don't think it's ever had many printings. I'm not sure about the USA. Seek it out. You might have to pay a 10 or 20 quid, but it's really, really great. And Ian is a cut above, or should I say a cleave above. Fantastic stuff. That's Meat, vegetarian horror. And he did a couple of other horror-based things at that time. There was The Power, as I say, and a great science fiction horror novel called The Fireworm, which began as a story entitled Jingle in Geordie's Hole in a sewer of Interzone. It was quite uncomfortable. Some quite uncomfortable sort of erotic stuff in that. But yeah, great stuff. But Ian, fascinating writer, a man of ideas. I think J.G. Ballard said the only real SF writer of ideas in Britain. And that was in the 80s. So there you go. I'm not sure if that's true, but that's what he said. So that shows you the esteem in which Ian is held. Something more recent, and something I've read this book 3 or 4 times, and I just want to check out the publication date, 2006, and this is Tim Lebbon's Berserk. And look at that for a jacket. And I don't choose these because they're cheesy. I choose them because I want to read a traditional horror novel, and I want to enjoy the tradition of the anti-aesthetic of, saying the unsayable and showing the unspeakable and the unshowable, in words. And words are very powerful. And I think that's why horror is such a great medium, getting that sort of doomy feel. And I love this. And Tim Lebbon lives in South Wales. I'd love to meet him and interview him one day. I'm sure he's a great guy. I think I had one brief contact with him once about possibly doing an event in the bookshop where I work, but that never came together. Maybe I'll try and get together with him. He's written loads of books. He's a jobbing author. He's had New York Times bestseller things, mostly sort of film times and what have you. And he's written all kinds of things, SF, horror, sort of crime type of influence things. But this is Berserk, and I love this. And I've got 2 copies of it. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to grab my limited edition hardcover, which is here, which I think I got this from the wonderful Andy Richards of Coal Tonnage Books in Devon. Hey Andy, and there it is. That's my hardcover copy of Berserk, and I'll just put Chambers to one side. Look at that for a cover. Look, there's no words on it. It's great. And that's Tim on the back there with a black t-shirt on. Good man. And Tim's a very deft writer, you know, he's really great. And this is a sort of presentation copy, this one. What is Berserk about? Well, it's I picked it up because there was an idea in it which was similar to an idea I had for a horror novel I've never written. I've tried several times, but it's never really got off the ground. And it's about a couple who are middle-aged, and their son has been in the army, and he has died, and they've received a letter saying, you know, unfortunately your son was killed by friendly fire during an exercise on Salisbury Plain. And of course I live in Bath in the west of England, and Salisbury Plain is no distance away. My partner and I drive across it a lot. You can't drive across the bit where the exercises are done. There's a large part of it is sort of cordoned off so the military can practice with tanks and guns and what have you. Very, very important part of Britain's sort of defence history, and has been for, you know, decades and decades, going back before the Second World War. And the dead soldier's father, you know, and his wife, they're sort of beside themselves, and they're not satisfied with the explanation of what's actually happened to their son. So they decide to track down some of his sort of fellow recruits, and some of whom have been sort of honourably or maybe dishonourably discharged. I can't recall the detail. And the father, who is the main protagonist in the book, he uncovers some rumours and makes his way to Salisbury Plain, to where he discovers his son may actually be buried, because they've never received the body or anything like that. And he manages to sort of get onto there without being captured by the military, and begins digging. But he finds something else, and what he finds is something terrifying. And what you're seeing here on the covers of the 2 edition is a hint as to what it is. Berserk's a fantastic traditional horror novel. As I say, I've read it 3 or 4 times. It really put a hook in me. And I can best sum it up by saying it's not a vampire novel, it's not a werewolf novel, but it is in that ballpark. We're talking maybe revenants, and I want to do a video about revenants, returners from the dead at some point, except it's not really like that, because you get these terms dead, undead, living dead, what have you, and I think all that nomenclature needs to be revisited and looked at. But Berserk, I think it's out of print. If you can pick it up, do. It's fantastic. It's one of my favourite horror novels of recent years. It really is quite something. Speaking of horror novels of recent years which have been quite successful, and I don't think this is obscure, but I think what I meant to come to when I said a bit obscure is that people, you know, they stick with Stephen King and almost anything else they haven't heard of. So except to a hardcore horror fan who's digging into it and getting into the culture, these things are obscure. They're not to you and me. If you out there are a hardcore horror fan, they're not to me as a bookseller. But for most readers who are stuck in that King Lovecraft access and swirling around and not really getting out of it, they might read a Max Brooks. They're not discovering these things. And the book I wanted to talk about next was Adam Neville, The Ritual. Now, you may have seen the film of this, which people have mixed feelings about The Ritual, about the film. I really like it. I think it's really good. And it has elements which are not in the book, especially at the beginning of the film. So if you've read the film, if you've seen the film and read the book, if you've read the film and seen the book, as it were, if you've seen the film but not read the book, do read it, because there are differences, and vice versa. I mean, sure, you cover both of them. And basically, I was talking to Tom Toner, the SF writer, who's a close friend of mine who lives in Bath, and he doesn't like the film. He thinks, he left out loads of stuff from the book. The book is much, much better. And it's true, there's a lot of detail in there, but I think they're mutually complementary. It's rather like Blade Runner and Duandra's Dream of Electric Sheep. I do think they work together quite well. And it's set in Scandinavia. It's about 4 men who go on a walk. They're sort of approaching middle age. They're about coming up to their midlife crisis. One of their friends has died, and they're going on a walk in memory of him. And like a lot of friends do as they age, they don't see each other very much anymore, but they go on this walk to remember their friend. And unfortunately, things take a wrong turn, as they say. And there's all sorts of elements in this, from Scandi folk horror to black metal. If you know what black metal is, I'm sure you do. And it's a fantastic traditional horror novel again. And the way that Adam Neville, I've read other books by him as well. There's one which invokes Aleister Crowley. Tom Toner tells me there's a great book called The Last Girl, which is a post-apocalyptic thing, which I really want to read and not go around to. But this is the one which has put the hook in me in the most. And I do like a traditional horror novel. When it comes to modern horror, things from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s onwards, I do like a certain classical structure, but I like to see what writers can do to bring contemporary things in. For example, the bringing in of, black metal. Obviously black metal's been with us quite a while now, but bringing that in without making it cheesy and silly and seeming just like a trend tick box exercise. It's quite a skill to do that, and Neville has that, and it's great stuff. So I would recommend that, even if you've seen the film, or if you have read the book but not seen the film, watch the film as well. So there you go, that's a great one. So maybe something a bit more seminal that you haven't come across, which I do sell when I can get hold of it. It is published in the USA, and I have to import it. And this is Ray Russell's The Case Against Satan. And for me, The Case Against Satan, that's such a great title. And what is it like? This is a book which came out in the early 60s. It's very slim, as you see. It's in Penguin Classics. Ray Russell was sort of like a gothic writer, anthologist, short story writer, who is, again, a real cult figure, little known outside horror circles and little known in the UK. And this was published in the early 60s, some 5 or 6 years before The Exorcist by William Peter Blatty. And it's quite similar, except because this came first. And it's really about faith and religion in the same way The Exorcist is, and how the church handles a case of possession, whether it handles it well, whether there is a case against Satan, whether there is a case against the church. And it's very elegant and sparse, but very well written. It's not flashy, there's the odd curlicue, and it's very direct, but the moral arguments and the sort of hair-raising bits are just written in a very matter-of-fact way, which I think is fantastic. And, any book that's called The Case Against Satan with a cover like this, I know it looks like Ransom Riggs, but don't let that put you off. It's a real gimmick book for kids, the whole Ransom Riggs thing. Those books would never have sold so well if they didn't have those gimmicky covers like this. But this is fantastic stuff. I really think this is great. So if you wanted to sort of look at the great precursor of The Exorcist, read The Case Against Satan from the early 60s. Fantastic stuff. Also thinking back, maybe a little bit further to that, something which would be a great sort of ghost story sort of selection for Christmas for you. I mean, something that I do in work every Christmas to sell loads of M.R. James, because surprisingly, loads of people have never read M.R. James, and it fascinates me. He's like the master of the English ghost story, the master of the ghost story. And of course, he wrote no novels, which is probably one reason why he's not as famous as he should be. Of course, he is famous to those of us who delve into things. So this is something similar, but different. And this is Sleep No More by L.T.C. Rolt. And this is published by History Press. And there you go. And L.T.C. Rolt, he was a non-fiction writer, basically. These are I think pretty much all his short stories. He used to write things like popular biographies of Isambard Kingdom Brunel. He wrote about engineering, the railways. So he was a kind of industrial archaeologist and historian of the Industrial Revolution, and his stuff's really readable. He's kind of the equivalent of Christopher Hibbert, so a really good history stroke science writer. And he worked with Robert Aikman, who's a noted figure in weird fiction, who's enjoying a revival the last few years. We'll talk about Aikman a bit later on, in founding sort of English Waterways Association to curate and preserve canals, because of course obviously canals went out of usage a long time ago in lots of places. They didn't keep going, not like the Kennet and Avon Canal, which is just down the road from me, where you can take a barge, which is lovely. But he sort of did a lot of work that way, and he wrote this wonderful collection of ghost stories, and they popped up in different places at different times. And they, it says the subtitle is Railway, Canal and Other Stories of the Supernatural. So they're based around things like railway lines, haunted railway lines, canals, Welsh mountains, what have you. And they're absolutely fantastic. They're really good stories. They are slim. They're models of efficiency. They have great smooth style. He's very, very readable, and it's the sort of book that you could devour it in one sitting, or you could read one a night over a cold sort of winter season, over about 10 days, and you just absolutely love it. Sleep No More by LTC wrote. So if you like the more traditional sort of ghost stories, and if you like films like Night of the Demon, you'd really love this. It's fantastic, and it's got a really great British feel about it without it being bourgeois or sort of class ridden in any way. It really does get you thinking about the coldness and the open spaces of Britain in the winter, and, you know, the lonely places which, you know, we avoid when it's dark. It is really, really great stuff. So this is something which I hope to be selling a lot this Christmas, because it was out of print for years. It came back to print a few years ago, and it's a really nice edition. History Press, great publisher. They do some fantastic stuff, a lot of which sadly doesn't get into bookshops these days because it's so specialised, but there you go. So I mentioned Robert Aikman. He's had a real revival in recent years. Now, if you know who Aikman is, he did write a novel which is kind of a mainstream social novel. He was a very sort of odd man. He was very sort of old-fashioned in lots of ways, and like I say, he knew and worked with Rolt on sort of canal preservation. And this is Dark Entries. Now, those of you who are goths or know your rock and roll will recognise that title. Dark Entries was used as a title by the seminal band Bauhaus back in, when did Dark Entries come out? It was a single. Was it early 80s? I'd say 80, 81. And they used that as a title of one of their songs. And of course, Bauhaus pop up in the film of The Hunger with David Bowie, based on the David Bowie. There's a 70s usage. David Bowie. I never call him Bowie. Why did that happen? It's a 70s sort of usage, I guess. And in The Hunger, the film of Whitley Strieber's novel, and they appear in that at the beginning with their wonderful song Bela Lugosi's Dead. Kids, if you don't know Bauhaus and you like the dark stuff, you really, really must check them out. They're fantastic. Anyway, this is Dark Entries, one of a number of Aikman's books reissued in recent years. For a while they were print on demand, more coming into print, and Other Stories has done his novel, which is a mainstream novel, as I say. Faber have done about 4 of these now, and they're lovely, really, really nice illustrations. Neil Gaiman is all of them saying, you know, he says he really is the best. Don't let that put you off, because even though I'm not a real fan of Neil's writing, he's got great taste, and he and I love all the same stuff. He's a good guy, really, and he's charming when I met him, I have to say. And these are strange stories. Everybody says the same thing about Aikman, is that some of them aren't really horror stories, some of them aren't really ghost stories. They're surreal, they're weird, they are really flaky, but they're great. They're not like anything else. They say they're not like anything else. I see certain links to people like Angela Carter and Anna Kavan. You know, you see the influences of people like Machen and Algernon Blackwood and, you know, arguably Lovecraft, but they're very, very well written. He does get talked a lot about in the sort of chattering circles, not read that much. And, you know, there are some lovely collections out there. This is a great place to start. There's a wonderful NYRB one called Compulsory Games, I think it is. I'll try and flash that up on the channel. But this I found is a great one to start. I'd only read bits by him before. I used to have an old Robinson edition of Cold Hand in Mine. They are marvellous titles, as you can tell. Cold Hand in Mine. Now that's a horror title, isn't it? Dark Entries, The Unsettled Dust, The Wine Dark Sea, which is a Homer quote, of course. These really are fantastic stories, and I'm not going to tell you much about them because they're very, very hard to describe. You just have to read them, but it's really good, weird fiction without the sort of, you know, messy, dusty bits that cling to poor style that you get. So it's really, really good stuff. I love that. Fantastic. So get yourself some Aikman. Lovely. I'm going to go back away now to a writer I think I mentioned earlier on. If I didn't, forgive me. If I did, forgive me again. And this is Dan Simmons, The Song of Carly. And as you see, this is a little headline hardcover, and it's actually in A format, the paperback, same text block. And I bought this when this came out in 86 or 87. This was Dan Simmons' first novel, and it won the World Fantasy Award. Now, the World Fantasy Award very rarely goes to sword and sorcery books. It goes to some, and the beauty of the World Fantasy Award is not as strong as it was, like none of the awards are as strong as it was, because the quality of writing in genre fiction has declined generally, and I'll go into that in another video, is that they pick all sorts of things. There's things from like sort of people who'll end up in Penguin Modern Classics. There's sort of real low horror. There's indefinable fantasy. There's SF. All sorts of people have won it. The World Fantasy Award, fascinating thing. Like Perfume by Patrick Suskind won the World Fantasy Award. It doesn't say that on the cover because, you know, that might put people off. But it is a fantasy novel. Christopher Priest, The Prestige won it, even though it's a science fiction novel. You know, it's a great award. Ken Grimwood replay, you know, the progenitor of Groundhog Day and all those posthumous fantasy sort of novels. It won it. But anyway, Dan Simmons' first book, Song of Carly, wonderful, wonderful, wonderful traditional horror novel. And I've read about 10 of Dan's books over the years. Obviously, the one you see a lot on BookTube YouTube is Hyperion, the first of the Hyperion Cantos, which is like the Canterbury Tales of science fiction, a great book. Got me back into traditional SF when I just completely lost interest, and I read that, and it sort of hooked me back into the genre. But I loved this first, and Dan can write anything, rather like Stephen King. He's a better writer technically, he has a much better style. You can really see the influence of Richard Matheson over both King and Simmons, but Simmons really is elevated things, and he's done a few sort of deaf books, but generally they're really good. He's written science fiction, fantasy, horror, general fiction, crime. The guy can do anything. He's really, really very talented indeed. And again, as I say, most Stephen King fans seem to have not heard of it, which baffles me completely. This is his first novel, late 80s, as I say, and it's about a man who I think he's a poet or literary critic or a journalist. I think he's a journalist. You see, I haven't read it for years. I've read it a few times. It is mentioned in one of my books. I think it's in 100 Must-Read Fantasy Novels. And he gets this assignment to go to India to seek out this dead poet who, as soon as I was reading about this poet, I thought, well, Rabindranath Tagore, it seems to be based on him. And it's a poet who is sort of supposed to be dead or has gone missing. And he goes over to Calcutta. He takes his wife and his infant child, and they go in search of this poet. And what they find is that the cult of Kali, the goddess of the thuggies, the stranglers, is still very much alive, and she, of course, she's the goddess of death and destruction, and she looks rather like she appears, of course, as a statue in Golden Voyage of Sinbad, doesn't she, a cracking Ray Harryhausen vehicle. So the thing about this is that there's only really one page where something that might be supernatural happens, but it's absolutely brilliant, and the rest of it, it does get you thinking about the reality of evil, and it's really about the evil of place, and it's set mostly in Calcutta, and of course the cliche that comes to mind is the black hole of Calcutta. And my friend Joe Roberts, the travel writer, who's a lovely guy, he's had several bestsellers in India. He's a fairly obscure figure in the UK, even though his books are great. He's written 2 travel books about India, one about the southern states, and also a novel about Edward Lear's time in India. He's a real sort of India file, Joe. He's a great guy. Maybe I'll get him on the channel one day, because he's a fascinating conversationalist, and I do need to spend more time with him, as we're both getting older now. We don't see each other much. But he wrote this great book about Calcutta, which is his 3rd travel writing book, and this is set in Calcutta, and this really puts the horror into place. So it's a novel of place, and the things that happen to the protagonist and his family, and he really becomes horrified with the place, and you're immersed in it. And I don't know whether Simmons visited Calcutta, but it's really, really amazing. I'm sure the people in Calcutta weren't very happy about it, but in using a location which is exotic and strange to Westerners, a wonderful ancient culture of India which has been there for thousands of years, which is so rich and colourful and interesting. There's a wonderful thing with it. Just as an aside, it sort of reminds me in a way of wonderful film called The Ghoul, which is made by Tyburn, which is like a sort of Hammer offshoot. Somebody from Hammer left to make horror films, which are very like Hammer films in the 70s, under the Tyburn banner. And they only made 2 or 3. One of them's Legend of the Werewolf. And The Ghoul is another one, which features John Hurt, Peter Cushing, and it's set in a moorland in England, and there isn't a DVD or Blu-ray of it. There was one really bad DVD of it, and it really needs reissuing, and there's a short version, a long version. It's got its flaws, but that's sort of Indian horror as well, but brought back by a colonialist played by Peter Cushing, and wonderful, wonderful films. So that's Horror of Place with The Song of Kali. Fantastic traditional horror novel from the 80s. Brilliant stuff. This is The Cormorant by Stephen Gregory. This is a signed first edition published by Heinemann back in 1986. This is a book I first read, is it 86 or 84? It's sort of mid to late 80s. I first read it in a wonderful Hodder and Stoughton paperback, which had a beautiful cover, which I don't have anymore. It's a B format, and it's a rather slim book. I say it was a debut, and it won the Somerset Maugham Award, which is a literary prize given to debut authors, and the money has to be spent on travel to broaden their mind so that they can write about all sorts of other things based on the experience. And Gregory did that, and he is a English writer. He spent a fair amount of time in Wales, lots of time in the Far East as well, and he mostly writes horror novels set in rural Wales, usually in North Wales. There is a video about him on the channel called The Avian Macabre of Stephen Gregory, in which I do talk about this a bit, but I want to mention this again because it's been reissued in the UK recently by Parthian Books, a Scots-based publisher, and it's in print in the USA from Valancourt, wonderful American publisher who are real Anglophiles. They do lots of great stuff. They do lots of Colin Wilson books, Christopher Priest, all sorts of people who are obscure and unfairly so. A lot of them you can't get in the UK for copyright reasons, not in bookshops. You have to get them from Amazon or from an online bookseller. Some of them are available, and they're mostly trade paperbacks. It's not a format I'm keen on, but they do wonderful, wonderful, wonderful stuff. So do seek Valancourt out because they're a magnificent publisher. I'm always looking at what they're doing. And if you like horror and weird fiction and obscure crime and things like that, they are really, really quite something. So The Cormorant is set in North Wales. It's about a man who has an inheritance from his uncle. His uncle dies, leaves him a cottage in Wales, and Gregory really combines beautiful nature writing. He writes about the countryside and the nature of Wales in a beautiful way. He could have been a nature writer, no problem at all, and made loads of money that way, but he wanted to write fiction. And in this inheritance, there's a clause in the will in which the protagonist and his family have to look after his uncle's pet, and it's a cormorant, and it goes on from there. And I'm not going to tell you any more, but it's one of the best written horror novels I've ever read. It's literary, it's serious, it has flashes of light and the wonderful nature things. You can really feel it. And the thing about British horror is that I always think that we never use the countryside and the particular old feeling of Britain enough in horror fiction and published in the UK. And there's a folk horror element to that, I guess. But Gregory wrote several novels, and then he disappeared for several years. He was working on screenwriting with William Friedkin, actually, the director of The Exorcist in the USA, on screenplays and stuff. But he's recently returned to horror fiction, and he's done a wonderful horror novel about gulls called Plague of Gulls, which is a fantastic book, which is out in paperback now from Valancourt. There was a limited edition from PS. Seek this out. The BBC made a short film based on it, featuring Ralph Fiennes. This is about 1990. Haven't seen it since. You can't get it on DVD. Read the book. It's absolutely brilliant. Nature horror of the most lyrical and dark kind. And it was a very important book in influencing what became known as the New Gothic in Britain in the late 80s, early 90s. There was a Picador anthology, the New Gothic, and people like Patrick McGrath were in there, and I think maybe Nicholas Robb. But this is great, great stuff. So I would really recommend that. Another British book I want to commend to you, which again I've mentioned before very briefly in the early days of the channel, is this wonderful piece of entertainment, Assassin by Sean Hudson, which is back in print again now. I don't particularly like the contemporary cover because I don't really think it works with the book. Now Sean does get looked down a bit and as a hack, but he's a great guy. I met him once and we had a fantastic time. A lovely, lovely man. He doesn't do many public appearances. Because he does suffer a bit from depression, I believe, or something like that. So, you know, leave him be and get on. And he's a fantastic entertainer. He's a splattermeister. I'm going to talk about this briefly. Assassin, I can only sum it up as being, it's like Get Carter meets Night of the Living Dead. So if you want a hard-boiled Brit grit crime novel which suddenly has something very, very strange and eldritch and supernatural and gory, and there's one bit in this, oh my god. So it's kind of like zombie crime, really, if you wanted a pigeonhole it. I don't like pigeonhole things like myself, but it's published by Star W.H. Allen. That's the first edition, and I read this at the time, and this was a point in which Sean W.H. Allen, Star, were trying to raise his profile, and he did make a quantum leap forward in his writing. He spent more time, but you know, he's a jobbing author, good guy. We need people like this to keep popular fiction going and to keep outraging the people who need to be outraged, you know, with their genteel ideas about what literature should be like, you know. And you know, I've read James Joyce, you know, I've read Faulkner, you know, and I still like Sean Hudson. You know, this is the thing. So Assassin, it's a great one. I'm going to mention another one. I've read several of Sean's books and they're very entertaining. At one point I was thinking of collecting him, but I decided that with my SF collecting and going down the horror rabbit hole was a bad idea as well. This is another favourite worth checking out. This is Twisted Souls. And as she's got a rather beautiful jacket, and a lot of Sean's books are out of print. They're hard to find. There's ebooks, print on demand, that sort of stuff, but I really like this one. And this is sort of small town tale, two couples, secrets in a church, an abandoned mine, and oh god, again there's one moment in it which I just winced to think, oh, I'm wincing now, I can't even think about it. It's real. Oh, it's really, really nasty. It's great stuff though. And the influence of people like Sean on sort of low budget British horror movie making and what have you, and vice versa, has been great, you know. And he really is a treasure. And you know, maybe there's some people who look down on him, but I like Sean's work. It's got lots of verve and energy and fire, and it's wonderful entertainment, great fun. Twisted Souls, it's a dark one, I can tell you that now. Speaking of dark ones, well, what have we got? Somebody who I've mentioned several times on the channel, and I'm determined to keep mentioning him until more people read him, is K.W. Jeter. This is Wolf Flow, a palindromic title, because of course flow is wolf backwards and wolf is flow backwards. And this is St. Martin's Press, I believe. And when is this from? I think this is from the 90s. You probably, it's a signed one. You see, we probably get the glare there, and if you can see the signature there. Got a few signed books by KW. I've never met him. My friend Les Escott from Bath used to publish Morrigan books. He knew Jeter really well. You know, they sort of shared a house back in the 80s at one point. And let's just have a look at this. This is from 1992. I've got the shades on because I was thinking of Vincent Price in The Tomb of Ligeia, a late Cormorant film, mostly filmed in Britain. Not a great film, but at least a stylish one, because I just look dreadful. But they're getting on my nerves, to be honest. I didn't much sleep last night. I woke up in the middle of the night thinking about all this horror. That's what it is. So the eye bags might freak you out, but you know, it is horror is what it is. You've got to sort of see reality, what is the naked lunch, what's on the end of the fork. Anyway, back to K.W. Jeter. Well, Jeter, as I think I said before, is critically generally regarded when doing his best work as a horror writer. He's done lots of SF, and he's wonderful. He's such a taboo breaker and a great stylist. And I've said before, the words which come to mind when I think of Jeter is that there's a sort of uncaring attitude in the prose. And I'm sure he's a lovely guy, you know, but the prose comes across and it says the world doesn't care about you. You're alone. It's like an existential thing. And the prose is very abrasive. It's like grazing your knees or your knuckles on raw concrete, you know, that hasn't been smoothed over. And that's what I like about this. I find it very, very bracing and stimulating. And Wolf Flow is set in a desert location, I seem to recall. And yeah, I know you can see the microphone. You know, I don't care. It's about content, you're not presentation. And it's a guy who, yeah, he, that's right. Yeah. Health is your only treasure. Guy called Mike, and he goes to a an abandoned spa in the desert, and he is trying to sort of get over some things in this small sort of arid town in the USA. And this sort of bath, this spa, is abandoned. You have broken tiles, what have you. But there's something strange about the water there. There's something evil about the water. Evil Water, funnily enough, is a sort of title of a collection by Ian Watson, who wrote Meat, that I mentioned earlier on. But the water here is evil, and it does something strange to people. It's a stunningly original book. The tone, as I say, is so cold and harsh and abrasive. Abrasive is the word that always comes to mind when I think of Jeter. And I find his stuff so bracing and entertaining. And he's written loads of really great horror novels. So, you know, you really should seek him out. And just to show you one with that really cheesy cover, I once showed this to a friend of mine in work, and she laughed and laughed. She said, how can you take a book with the cover like this seriously? And I said, because you shouldn't judge a book by its cover. Of course you can. That's the fact of it a lot of the time. This is Dark Seeker, which I've read twice. A lot of his books are set in LA, and this is about a cult, a drug cult, which gives you access to something called The Host. And this is wonderful. You know, there's quite a few of Jeter's books are out there in this sort of format. And as you see, this is pristine. It's because I know how to look after my books. I can read them and they look the same afterwards. And of course, I bought that new back in the day, which is the 80s, and fantastic stuff. So Jeter really is, for me, I would put him in my top contemporary horror writers in the world, in the top 3 or 4. So, you know, you really should seek him out. And Wolf Flow, stunningly original, because as much as I like traditional horror, I do like to see something original as well. And this is really quite something. So what have we got left? Have we done 10? I think we probably have. I just want to mention a couple more writers you might want to try. This is Nicholas Royal, Regicide. I keep seeing a copy of this in Hay and Y, and I think at the cinema bookshop, and I think it's a copy I sold to them because I had 2 copies. This is a signed one. I got it somewhere else. It's not signed to me, it's signed to somebody else. And Nicholas is a great guy, amazing author. There is a video on the channel about him. Do watch it before you buy anything by him. It's very, very important you understand this. There is a mystery connected to Nicholas, which is fascinating and amusing, possibly even infuriating. So don't buy anything by him until you watch his video, please. I'm not just saying this to get views. You must do that. Otherwise, you may end up with the wrong book. And I'm not going to explain that. Watch the video because it's fascinating stuff. This is Regicide, and this is wonderful. And Nicholas edits an anthology called Best British Short Stories. He edits it most years, and he's a great guy, and he's got his own press called Nightjar, which does little sort of short story collections. He's done a Maxim Jakubowski recently, a John Fox, which I reviewed on the video, and he's a fantastic guy. One day I'm going to try and write something and submit it to him and hope that he'd publish it, but you know, he just the top people. He's fantastic. Anyway, so this is Regicide, and this is about a guy who runs his own little record shop, sort of backstreet sort of thing, lots of dusty or vinyl LPs, and he meets this woman who he sort of falls gradually in love with, and then he sort of loses her and has to go in search of her, and it leads him into a realm unlike any other I've seen in fiction. And it's hard to know whether the realm that you enter is real or of the imagination, but it's really great stuff. But Nicholas has written quite a few horror stories, and he's really, really good. So, but watch that video, check it out. One more shout out for another writer, because I'm sure I've done 10 now. Somebody I really love is Chelsea Quinn Yarbrough. There is a video about her on my channel, and Chelsea's wonderful. I'd love to meet her. She's brilliant. And this is sort of traditional stuff. These are vampire novels. There are 30 of them, and she's got 2 which I think are unpublished at the moment. She seems to have lost her deal with Tor, or she's sort of doing a deal with somebody else, I'm not certain, and she's sort of getting on in years now, but she's really wonderful. And this is Crusader's Torch, which is one of them. There are 30 of them, and they're about an immortal vampire called Saint Germain, who's based on a real person. Very, very interesting. Do check the video about her on my channel. And they're very much comfort reads to me. And Chelsea's thing is that history is horror, so she researches a period, puts her immortal vampire into that period, writes a wonderful historical novel with traditional supernatural horror elements, but there's still nothing else like them, and they are so wonderful. And I have to say, I was going through a very difficult time personally for a few years, sort of about 10 years ago, and Chelsea's books were of enormous solace to me. They're just absolutely wonderful, and they're great traditional, exciting, pulse beating, wonderfully researched historical novels of horror. History is horror. Chelsea Quinn Yarbrough. She's wonderful. I absolutely love her work. If I met her, I'd probably be overawed, and I'm not overawed by authors very often, but I really, really think she's something special. Great, great stuff. So that's my sort of top 10 plus a few more modern obscure horror writers. The idea being that the obscurity is in, you know, the mainstream of the people who stick to King and Lovecraft and don't step outside. So if you're familiar with all of these, I apologize, forgive me. I'm sure you've probably enjoyed them as well. If you haven't, do seek them out. There will be more horror on the channel. I'm not a huge horror buyer. I like to cherry pick very much. You can't collect everything unless you're loaded, which I'm not. Life is short. There's not time to read everything. But I'd love to hear what your sort of really sort of contemporary and modern horror picks are, which I might not have read. So this is Outlaw Bookseller. Have a happy Halloween, as they say, even though this is going out beforehand and I'll be doing something else. And bye for now. Like, subscribe, comment, all that stuff. And I've got to put this place back in order now, which is going to be horrific in itself. Cheers then. While the rest of heaven was blue, of a demon in my view.